All right, ready to dive into something captivating and disturbing.
Oh, definitely.
Today we're tackling the case of Aileen Wuornos,
Aileen Wuornos.
one of the most infamous uh, female serial killers,
Yeah.
really, in American history.
It's one of those cases that it just stays with you.
It does.
Even decades later.
Yeah, and we're not just rehashing headlines here, right?
No.
You provided us with like a treasure trove of information.
Absolutely.
Like we've got biographical accounts, court documents, psychological analysis. Like we are going deep.
Yeah.
So buckle up, listeners. We're taking a deep dive into Aileen Wuornos.
We are going to look at not just what she did, but why her case is still so debated today.
I mean, it brings up everything.
Absolutely.
Death penalty to how society views women who are violent.
Right.
Okay, so picture Florida in the late 80s.
Okay.
We're talking like desolate highways, truck stops, and a string of murders that like terrified this state.
Yeah, and right at the center of it all is Aileen Wuornos.
Aileen Wuornos.
Working as a prostitute, claiming self-defense.
Oh, wow.
In the deaths of 7 men.
7 men.
7 men.
In less than 2 years.
It's a story that grabs you from the get-go.
Right from the start, yeah. Before we get into like those chilling encounters,
Yeah.
we got to understand like where it all began.
Oh, absolutely. We have to really grasp this case, we have to start with her early life.
I mean, her childhood, rough.
Yeah.
We're talking born in 56, abandoned by her mother, raised by abusive grandparents.
It's hard to even imagine the impact
Right.
that has on a child.
Yeah, and it gets even more heartbreaking.
Okay.
By the age of 11, Wuornos was already engaging in prostitution.
Wow.
11 years old.
To survive.
To survive.
11 years old.
Let that sink in for a moment.
That speaks volumes.
It's unbelievable, right?
About the lack of support systems,
Yeah.
For vulnerable young people.
Yeah.
And it just makes you think, how much does someone's environment really influence their choices later?
Yeah, it's a question that haunts this entire case.
It really does, yeah, because it's like this early trauma becomes this backdrop for everything that follows.
Right.
It's a theme you see in a lot of serial killer cases, this intersection of childhood trauma and violence.
Yeah, and that brings us to Florida's highways.
Right.
Between 89 and 1990, Wuornos killed 7 men.
Each one more disturbing than the last.
It's a lot. So to really understand how we got here,
Yeah.
we got to look for the MO. Right?
Yeah, her MO is really telling in this case.
For those who don't know MO, it's basically like criminals' habits or techniques.
Right, their signature.
Yeah, so like in Wuornos' case, she often used her work as a prostitute
Right.
to target men that were traveling alone,
Alone, vulnerable.
usually near truck stops, rest areas.
Creating that sense of vulnerability.
Okay, so let's talk victims.
Okay.
The first one, Richard Mallory.
Richard Mallory.
His case is really interesting
It is.
because he actually had a history of violence himself.
Against women. Which is it's just so...
Yeah, it's another layer.
It really does, yeah. Like, was this some sort of twisted revenge, or was it something more primal?
Right.
Like this desperate need to protect herself.
Was she afraid?
Right.
That's a question we're going to be asking throughout this whole thing.
Absolutely.
Now, I know we have details on each victim. To really get this,
Yeah.
we need to focus on, like, what connects them, the
Wow.
big picture.
You're right. We don't want to get bogged down in the minutia.
Right, exactly.
I mean, one of the things that I noticed was that many of the victims were shot multiple times,
Oh, wow.
which suggests a level of rage, don't you think?
It does make you wonder, yeah.
Desperate need to overpower.
Yeah. And the way she left the bodies, like, along the highways,
It's discarded, almost like she was trying to erase them.
trying to hide what she'd done.
Right. And that's premeditation, don't
Yeah.
you think? Like, she was trying to avoid being caught,
Oh, for sure.
trying to control the narrative.
Yeah. And that brings us to something that came out later. Wuornos' initial claim wasn't just self-defense.
It wasn't?
It was that all of these men had either raped or attempted to rape her.
Oh.
So how much of that is true?
Right.
And how much of that is her past trauma?
Because if it's true, that paints a very different picture.
It really does.
It's not a cold-blooded killer. It's a victim that reached a breaking point.
Right.
But if it's not true, that begs the question.
What drove her to
To
this?
such extremes.
Yeah, and that's what we're going to unpack.
Yeah.
As we delve deeper into this very complex and troubling case,
Mhm.
takes us right to the legal proceedings, doesn't it?
Oh, yeah, it was a media spectacle.
Totally.
This was not just some Florida thing, right? This was national news.
Oh, absolutely. Everyone was talking about Aileen Wuornos.
So how did they catch her? It's not like she was leaving a trail of
Right.
breadcrumbs.
Well, actually, her downfall was someone close to her.
Oh, really?
Yeah, her lover, Tyria Moore.
Tyria Moore, complicated relationship, to say the least. Yeah. Moore ended up going to the police and even talking to Wuornos
No way.
on recorded phone call.
Oh, wow.
Where Wuornos confessed to the murders.
And they used those in court.
Oh, yeah. Key pieces of evidence.
Wow. Talk about a betrayal, though.
Right. Painted her as cold and calculating, preying on these men.
But her defense, they argued that her actions were a direct result of what she went through, right?
Right. They brought up her past, the abuse, the dangers of being a prostitute.
Right, like she was always on guard.
Exactly. They even suggested she might have a mental illness.
Which is interesting because now you've got these two sides clashing in court.
Absolutely. Like, did she really believe that she was in danger? Or was it something else? Was she manipulating everyone?
Right, good question.
Yeah.
And it's something the jury had to figure out. So what do you think, what was going through her mind when she changed her plea to guilty?
Right.
That's a big moment.
It's huge.
Right, changes everything.
And to this day, we still don't know why she did it. Yeah, some people think she just felt defeated, knew it was over. But others think maybe her lawyers pressured her. Who knows?
Wow, so you have these two images of her, right? This victim turned perpetrator and this like cold-blooded killer.
Right.
And they're both present throughout this whole trial.
Exactly. And the media at the time really didn't help. They loved the sensational stuff.
Yeah, it's always about the headlines.
Right. Female serial killer everywhere. Nobody's really looking at the nuances of her life.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that like what we see in the media and what's really happening are two different things.
Totally. And unfortunately for Wuornos, the jury went with the prosecution.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, guilty on 6 of the 7 murders, sentenced to death.
Death row, I mean, that's got to do something to a person.
Right. It's heavy stuff. It's interesting, though, because in those final years, she became even more of a mystery.
Really?
Oh, yeah. She did a lot of interviews, said some wild stuff, sometimes even contradicting herself, almost like she wanted to be in control of how people saw her.
Even at the very end.
Yeah, even then.
It makes you think about how we shape our own stories.
Right. And for her, it wasn't just about the crimes anymore. It became about something bigger. The death penalty, how we see women who fight back. It's complicated.
Totally. It's easy to judge from a distance.
Oh, yeah.
But this case, it's like it forces us to look at some ugly truths.
Sure.
About our justice system, how we treat people who are struggling, and the role that trauma plays.
Absolutely. It's something that sticks with you.
It does. It really does.
And it's a conversation that we're still having, especially with that movie that came out.
Monster, right.
Yeah, Monster.
With Charlize Theron. She won an Oscar for that.
Exactly. And it really got people talking about Aileen Wuornos again, but in a different way, a more human way.
It really brought her story back into the spotlight, didn't it?
Oh, yeah, big time. It's like people were seeing Aileen Wuornos for the first time,
Yeah.
Like all this sensational stuff was stripped away, and you were left with this human story.
Right. And it made people think about like the bigger picture too.
Oh, for sure. Like all the things that led her to that point.
Right. And that's what makes true crime so interesting, isn't it? It's like we're fascinated by these stories, these dark stories, because they make us question everything.
They do.
About like human nature.
Absolutely.
And Monster definitely did that. I mean, it didn't shy away from the violence or anything, but it also showed you the other side.
Yeah. Like the side you don't see in the news.
Exactly.
All right. There's like poverty, abuse, the threat of violence.
Which is something that a lot of women in her position face.
Exactly.
It's like the film gave her a voice.
When you put it that way, it's true. She had been defined by everybody else up to that point.
Right.
It was like the media, the courts, even her own lawyers. It was like finally she was a person.
Yeah. And that's a powerful thing, right?
Absolutely.
Like when you can actually empathize with someone, even just a little.
Yeah.
It allows you to have these deeper conversations.
Like about what justice really means.
Exactly. And accountability.
Yeah.
Like the human experience. Yeah. And I think it's important to say, we're not saying what she did was right.
No, not at all.
But we're trying to understand it.
We're trying to make sense of it, right? And I think that's what makes this whole deep dive thing so important.
Totally.
Like we're not just looking back at some case from the past,
It's bigger than that.
It's about looking at the bigger picture and asking the tough questions.
Like, how do you explain those murders? I mean, she claims self-defense, but there's just so much there.
Right.
I mean, it's something people are still talking about today, and maybe there's not an easy answer.
And that's okay,
Is it?
Yeah, I think sometimes the best thing you can do is sit with those questions, the ones that make you uncomfortable.
The ones that don't have easy answers.
Exactly. And we can't forget about the whole sex work angle either.
Right, that's a huge part of this.
It is. It's like a whole other layer of complexity.
It really is, and it reminds us that things aren't always what they seem.
Absolutely.
Like, everybody has their own story, their own perspective.
Right. And it's easy to get caught up in the headlines and the labels.
Oh, I know, like, is she a victim? A vigilante? A
Mm.
monster? It's never that simple.
It's never that simple, and I think that's what we have to remember. We can acknowledge that her life was hard,
Yeah.
but that doesn't mean that what she did was okay.
It's about seeing both sides.
Exactly. And I think if there's one thing to take away from this whole deep dive, it's that the legacy of Aileen Wuornos is about having these conversations.
Yeah, not just about her, but about the whole system.
Exactly. The justice system, our responsibility to each other, how we treat people who are struggling.
It's like her story forces us to look inward.
It does. It makes us think about our own perceptions and biases and how we treat each other.
And maybe even make some changes.
Right.
Well, it's been a fascinating look at the Aileen Wuornos case. Disturbing, for sure.
Definitely.
But ultimately, I think we learned a lot.
I agree.
And, this is the beginning of the conversation, right?
It is. It always is.
We want you to keep thinking about this. Keep learning, seek out different perspectives, and for goodness sake, keep asking those tough questions.
Yeah, because that's how we learn. That's how we grow.
It is. And who knows, maybe it's those tough questions that make the world a better place.
Maybe they do.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Yeah, this is a good one.